So I was about to start recording, and then I started thinking about what the first words I was going to say are, and I was like, wait, do I say hello everyone? Or do I say hello again? I was like, why am I questioning this so much? It's so funny. But hey, hello. This is welcome back. Today we're talking about Final Fantasy XVI, which is I think came out last Thursday, 8 days ago at the time of recording. This should go up the same day, but well, just in case it suddenly doesn't come up on the 30th of June. Uh, yeah, so I've been playing the game, not tons. I played a bit of the demo, but I didn't want to finish the demo. I was kind of like I didn't want to carry my progress across or anything like that. I was like, I'm just gonna play the game when it comes out fully. But I was curious, so I was like, I'm gonna try out the demo, see, just kind of get a little idea, a little taste of it. But I was already sold on it, already had it pre-ordered and everything like that. So it probably wasn't really worth it, but it kind of just gave me a little teaser, and I actually kind of appreciate the fact that I could do that to kind of just like be able to play a game, a couple of weeks or whatever out from launch, and I think especially the fact that it was from the beginning of the game. Usually I'm against that because I'm like, no, give me something that's so vague part of the way through the game, gives me an idea of the game overall. But there's something about how they've done this demo and the way the game begins anyway that you kind of get a pretty decent idea of what's going on, or at least kind of what kind of game it is. And I didn't finish it, so I actually didn't know how the demo ends. And then obviously getting the full game, I sort of got to see that play out. And yeah, this game has been really cool, honestly. I think particularly from the sort of a story direction, just gameplay and audio, like it's all super high quality, and I thought that in the demo, and I certainly carried across to the main game as well. And it's weird. Like I'm kind of like I'm sort of unsure how far I actually am into the game, because I have the first two or three what seem like story trophies, and it looks like there's about 12, but they're all hidden, so I don't want to check what they're saying. But the PS5 says I'm like 35% of the way through, and I think I've played it for about 7 or 8 hours. So, it's not that that's like doesn't mean the game's going to be super short or anything, but I'm like, man, it feels like the game's still got more to open up with, and I'm like hoping there's still a bunch of the game left, sort of beyond that, so you really get to kind of, you know, delve deep into everything. But to be fair, I know there's a new game plus and everything, so there's gonna be plenty of time and plenty of ways you can kind of like, try out all the abilities and everything like that. But anyway, enough about that. Let's get into kind of like sort of the first thing I want to talk about with Final Fantasy. I'm just gonna go over, spoiler free, what I've been playing so far, what I think of like kind of the main aspects, what's kind of standing out to me so far. And I actually think, even though the game has like, really fun combat, the boss fights are incredible on their scale. Uh, it's actually the story that's grabbing me a lot right now, and it's annoying because like I would play it for a day, I'd play it for a few hours, and I wouldn't play it for a couple of days, and then I would kind of be telling myself I need to get back to it. I wouldn't necessarily have that pull, but very quickly, within like 20-30 minutes, I feel like I'm back in the world, I'm enjoying the combat, and that's why it's so annoying whenever I take a break from games, because you kind of like you lose that spark of like wanting to carry on playing. But yeah, the story is really, particularly the way that the characters are, all the characters so far have been really, really good and very, you know, very memorable. There's some just like the voice acting is just honestly, it really there's something about the way that these scenes in the story are directed that I really like, that really helps kind of solidify the kind of tone and themes and the character development and interactions that they're all having. Like, for example, one of my favorite things that they do is, especially between kind of like, you might go for like a long stretch of gameplay or a, crazy boss fight, and they'll know when to kind of, tune that down a little bit and kind of refocus things on like the story, and have like a quieter moment. And they do that really well, especially when they do this thing in cutscenes, which I'm sure like I think plenty of games do, but it's the way in which it all comes together here that you don't see very often, I don't think, is they like mute all of the background sound, or not so much all of the background sound, but they take away music. There's no music, it's purely just the atmospheric noise, uh there, and then the dialogue is paced so well and spoken in such a, just again very high quality, and you get this true sense of like these are actual people, and you actually it's almost like narrative immersion. Like you actually feel like you can kind of put the controller down for a minute, which I know some devs don't like they want you to keep the control in your hands, but you kind of get to kind of just sit there and just sort of really sort of soak it all in, listen in intently to the conversations. And one of the coolest things as well is that, which I didn't actually, like, I've still got time to edit it, but I didn't at the moment. I haven't written it in my impressions article that's going to go up alongside this. Is you have a thing called active time lore, which is like a little menu you can pull up during cutscenes, and it essentially gives you all this different information on what's going on, and so you can view. So if you're unsure on who characters are or where it's taking place and what's going on, I've not made use of it completely just yet, but some of these conversations aren't just simple. There's a lot of jargon thrown around and a lot of names and places and history and you know so it's kind of like it's listening intently, but there are points where I'm like kind of pausing it, maybe checking that a couple of times, or just kind of trying to sort of think, who are they on about? Who is this again? There's a bit of confusion in that sense, but I think that's what you get from like RPGs when you got so much going on. There's obviously a lot of different characters, um, but even so, just the way that's not really a critique, by the way. That's just a total me thing. But I just wanted to call out that feature. The active time lore is a really cool aspect to have. But yeah, these cutscenes and the dialogue and all the characters are really well performed and really believable. And already I've got like favorite characters. I think my favorite so far is Sid, who is played by Ralph Ineson, I believe is the actor's name. And he's not only has he got just a very iconic voice, like I've heard that voice. He's in Diablo as well, but he's just it's the characters that he plays and the personality and just the way that how he is towards Clive and the rest of the cast that I just really like. And yeah, but they're all great. Clive, I think Clive's a really cool character. He has got like the kind of typical like moody kind of main character vibe about him, but I don't think I hate that. And again, just strong voice acting, and plus you understand his motivations and you understand what he's going through, and it's honestly like quite. I don't want to spoil it too much, but it's a dark story, and it's just really interesting to kind of see. And there's a lot of intrigue. I don't know where it's going, and I'm excited to learn where it's going, and it's doing this really well. And yeah, obviously you understand that this is a huge world with so much going on in it, so you understand that just beyond the kind of inner conflict that Clive is going through and the characters around him, you understand and that yet there's so much more to this world, and that more's going to happen. You can kind of just tell by the way and as things are progressing, and as you get introduced to new characters, it's just really good. And there's a lot of cool elements at play here tonally and in its themes that I really do like. But yes, that's not about the story. I've spoken a lot longer on the story than I wanted to, but it honestly is the thing that's standing out to me. But the other aspect, which initially I wasn't too sure, but as soon as you start getting abilities and you start getting into the flow, the combat is really fun. And it's quite obviously, heavily inspired by Devil May Cry. I mean, the combat director is Ryota Suzuki, and he worked on DMC5 as a designer. So you can kind of see where some of that essence is kind of bleeding in. And it's kind of like, it's less, I don't know how to compare it to DMC, but like DMC has a lot of like abilities you can kind of pull off more or less at any moment, whereas Final Fantasy is obviously being more of an RPG, has things on cooldowns. There's a little bit more of a tactical element going on. But that doesn't just apply to like your core ability set. That also applies to the mechanics of combat in itself. And so you'll have moments where enemies have a will gauge that you can essentially, it's like a stun bar, and you knock it down so far, and then you stagger them, and then you can kind of like just go crazy on dealing loads of damage. That's usually only on like larger enemies and bosses, but I guess kind of spoilers for something combat like ability related, but kind of a mechanic that I've just got. This is from I'll just say it's from like the second big boss of the game. If you count the stuff in the prologue as the first big boss, you get an ability where you can pull enemies towards you, and you can use that on these like larger enemies that are being staggered. I'm not entirely sure about bosses, but at least I think you can do it on bosses. But at least on like larger enemies, just in standard combat, when you get the will gauge to 50%, you can grab them and pull them down to the ground, and they're kind of like momentarily knocked out, which allows you to kind of have like a window of like dealing damage without kind of fear of being attacked. And so that's like a layer on top of like the existing sort of formula there. And obviously, I know there's like plenty of more abilities that I'm going to be able to get, and then you've got the skill tree and other things like that. Um, but it's just like really cool how all of this comes together, because then on by extension, when they do get fully staggered and knocked down, the way that the game works is that once they're staggered and knocked down, they have to kind of build up their will gauge again, which takes several seconds. And during that time, you can deal just as much damage as you possibly can. But the way there's a layer of like it's kind of a tactical element to it, where from my understanding, I'm pretty sure the game says that it basically ramps up your damage to 1.5 times what it usually is as you deal that, as you attack. I don't know if that's like consecutive attacks or whether it falls off or whether it's just like you keep attacking and then it kind of builds up. But what I try and do is I try and fire off as many attacks as possible, but I try and save my abilities for like right near the end of that window, just so that you've kind of ramped up that sort of damage sort of bonus. And so that then there's kind of a layer of like, trying to deal as much damage and trying to figure out the best abilities to use and when to use them during that window that can allow you to kind of get the most damage dealt in that particular time. So then once they have their will gauge back up, you're back to standard combat again, and you're, dodging them. And a lot of the larger enemies seem to have a second phase as well, where they start throwing out extra abilities, and that's sort of, it's obviously more present on sort of stronger enemies, more sort of boss or mini boss kind of enemies, but it is still present, I think, on some of the sort of, I don't say easier enemies, but some of the lower end of those sort of bigger bosses, or sort of like, I guess not your standard mobs, but like your elites and things like that. And so, yeah, it's just really fun. And then all the abilities, I mean, like the base set abilities you can teleport to enemies, and then you can attack as you exit out of that, and then you can dodge. And if you dodge enemies at the right time, you can do a counter attack, and that applies to both your melee and your ranged. And one of the coolest things is that if you have a certain combo thing where you can combine melee and ranged at the same time. If you attack and land that melee attack right after you landed, if you press the magic, your ranged button, you'll fire up a quick attack, and so you can chain kind of melee ranged, and what I do is my sort of attacks right now is like I'm sort of doing that, and then right as I land that last standard attack, I'm already holding my magic range button and I'm charging it up, which allows me to sort of fire a even powerful projectile at the same time as with another upgrade. I'm holding down the melee attack button to charge up Clive's sword with fire. So then I fire off that blast with my left hand, I teleport towards them, and then I sort of let go of Square, and he'll slam his sort of sword into the ground, it'll create like an explosion. And it's stuff like that you get into this like real flow, and especially as you're adding in new abilities to that, you're also starting to consider what other ways you can kind of take on these enemies, and and it's very sometimes it can feel a little I don't know how to describe it, but like sometimes the flow, like getting towards enemies, it's almost like you might as well just teleport towards them, and it doesn't sometimes feel that it flows necessarily as well. It's kind of it's almost like, but that's, to be fair, that's where the whole grab enemies, pull you towards you comes in. So sometimes you are fighting in like more open areas and enemies are kind of spread out, and I think that can sometimes feel a little like the flow is not perfect, especially because it kind of takes you out of your sort of momentum. And currently I only have a single jump, there's no double jump, which is, you can jump off enemies, which is again a very Devil May Cry thing from that, called enemy step, where you could just like, you jump, and if you're near an enemy, you jump, you press jump again, and you jump, bounce off that enemy. And I think I have it upgraded, or I can get it upgraded, and you get a second time of that. But there's nothing right now that lets you sort of jump in the air and pull enemies towards you. You kind of have to use an ability, or you have to sort of, you can jump sort of off the ground, but I'm hoping that sort of deepens later to sort of make that aerial combat a little bit more complex. But yeah, that's a simple way to describe how I feel right now is just, it's really good, it's really fun, and I have two sets of abilities from the icons, who are obviously like the sort of demon god ability master things, whatever they are. I'm pretty new to Final Fantasy, so I'm still kind of that's stuff I'm still not sure on. Uh, but yeah, and that's obviously talking about core combat. But then on the flip side, you've got these Eikon battles where I won't say too much about them specifically, but as was shown in all the trailers, the scale of these are ridiculous. And when you have the first one quite relatively early on, it was pretty simplistic and there wasn't really much feedback in the controller. And so while the visuals were good and while like when you get hit, there's like a lot of feedback there, the visuals didn't quite match up to the feedback, and it was a little bit disappointing to me. I was like, come on, right? You've especially with the PS5, you talk about haptic feedback and things like that. Why aren't you leaning into this? So that one was a little underwhelming, at least on the feedback, sort of like I said, immersion side, but on visuals were crazy and just honestly very cinematic. And uh, as is the same with the second one, these visuals are just like God of War, like the biggest boss fights I've seen, I think, since God of War 3 back on PS3 in 2010. They're really insane, and the second one in particular felt a lot more not only involved gameplay wise, because the other one was kind of, I wouldn't call it a QTE, but it didn't feel very sort of, it wasn't demanding much from me or anything. But the second one you get to is way more over the top and kind of requires you to. It's more, you're more playing it rather than you are just pressing buttons kind of thing. And not that the first one's a QTE, but there's not much going on in them. But yeah, this one here is the second one's crazy, and one of them has even reminded me of sort of Metal Gear Solid 4's boss battle between Metal Gear Ray and Rex. That, I mean, like, with it, obviously I won't say exactly how it reminds me of that, but you'll know when you play it if you've played MGS4. And it's quite interesting. I heard that the Icon battles were intended to kind of embody different kinds of gameplay styles, and so I'm really curious to know how that sort of where that goes from here. And what's crazy is you talk about scale. There was a point where I was like, I had like a mini boss fight, and I was like, oh cool, right, so that's probably like the boss fight for this area. And then you carry on a bit further, and then you have like you get like the actual boss fight. It's like, oh, okay, so that's it. And then there's like a second phase. So I was like, oh, okay, right. So that was the final one, right? Okay, we're done. It wasn't the end, and it carries on. And I won't obviously spoil much of what happens after that either. But it's kind of ridiculous how far the game sometimes goes with this like scale, where it's like, oh, you think we're done? No, we're not done. We've got like another like bigger version of boss battle, and then another one, and it probably on paper it might sound like a bit kind of one dimensional, like it doesn't, almost just because it's like, this is kind of getting out of hand now, but it doesn't. It feels really, it's paced really well, and it's wrapped up in the story, and so all of these are almost as exciting as the previous one, but if not more so. And yeah, it's really cool. And one thing I'll say, just going quickly back to the core combat, the sort of a critique that I had, or no, I wouldn't say critique, like criticism, but just something that the controls are a bit weird, and I was sort of going into it thinking it was like Devil May Cry, and the buttons are not like that. They're kind of they're similar, but they're not all in the same place, and so that felt a bit weird. But what I did was I think it's a different preset in the options. But your ranged magic attack is on triangle, and your melee attack is on square. Well, that kind of felt a little bit I don't say jarring, but when you're trying to play it and you don't want to keep taking your thumb off the camera anyway, and then you're having to like swap between two buttons, it's kind of like, well, the camera doesn't matter because you can lock on, but um, yeah, swapping your thumb between square and triangle, it doesn't have the right flow. So I changed the controls, and so now I have my range magic on L1, and I also made it so that lock on I had to hold, and I hold L2 now. Um, Whereas, because like in DMC, when you're locking on, it's not a toggle, it's a hold on, and that kind of is just better for flow, I think. Whereas if you have a lock on, it can sometimes feel like you're kind of like locked into it, obviously. And so for me, I sort of changed that to a hold rather than a sort of a button press. And it feels so much better because what it means is you can run while tapping L1 to shoot while you've got your sort of right thumb on the camera and you're moving. And it also means that as you're attacking, when I was talking about that combo before where you attack and then melee and then range attack, melee attack range, you're able to do that without moving your thumb. And so essentially you're just like square L1, square L1. And it makes it easier to charge up one while you're still attacking with the other as well. So that's been a much greater flow for the game for me. And so if you're playing and you feel if you're running the same issues, I'd 100% recommend you do the same as me in that regard. But yeah, combat's really cool. It certainly feels like a more tactical version of DMC with all these different RPG elements. You know, that sort of it rewards you with your perfect dodges, with counterattacks, and enemies having like a stun meter, and being able to stack them with your bonus damage. So there's a level of that sort of, I guess, RPG sort of origin from Final Fantasy where you kind of, it's still keeping faithful to that. And speaking of the RPG aspect, I'm not really sure how I feel about these right now. It's not like I don't like them. It just, right now, I haven't sort of felt that there's too much depth going on here. And what I mean by that is that primarily the RPG aspects are entirely driven by stats, and that applies to your gear as well as accessories, where you're not really getting anything that's adding on to a playstyle or anything like that, or enhancing it. There is a little bit of that, but it comes in the form of like, oh, this thing does 8% more damage or 10% more damage, and I don't hate that, but to me, I was kind of, I don't want to say I was hoping for it, but like, what I like in RPGs is when, it's not, nothing to do with like, oh, I don't like the stat aspect, but it's like, you want them to kind of give you a new way to, or make you think about the sandbox, the combat in a different way, where you get a piece of gear and it's like, oh, this thing allows this thing to, this creates this, like your, I don't know, like one of your abilities has like an extra effect that's caused by this, like, these gauntlets or whatever. I always think that that's kind of what you want. I understand that's maybe not what Final Fantasy is, and so yeah, another aspect to that is your gear doesn't change cosmetically. It doesn't change other than the sword, which does. Now, to be fair, as I said, this might be how Final Fantasy usually is. But to me, it can sometimes make gear feel hollow because it's just like, like you get a new gauntlets, and it's just like, oh, you put them on and your stats have got changed, but that's it. But it's like, yeah, the gauntlet image is like a different, like it's got a different icon suggesting it looks different, but yet there's no change in your character, and it doesn't change anything about your character other than, oh, you have like 3 extra defense now, and it's also difficult to know what that stat boost actually means because you're not actually, at least so far, I've not encountered anything that's sort of actually being like, oh damn, like this enemy's like high level, and maybe I need more defense for this, or maybe this enemy, or maybe just in general that you need more defense, and everything's kind of scaling with me at the moment, like both enemies and the gear I'm getting. And so I actually, the sword I was using for a while, it was a lower, didn't have as high a attack value, and that was because it was a sword I got from one of the bosses. I got like a resource I got from one of the bosses that I could use to craft a unique sword, and it looks, pretty cool. And you kind of expect, you're like, oh, so maybe it's got a unique effect that kind of goes along with that, but it doesn't. That seemingly anyway, unless I'm missing something. And to me, that just sort of feels, like I said, hollow. It's like, okay, so and then what's funny is, right at that same time, I'm pretty sure I could craft a sword that was like, higher damage, and then a couple of hours later in the story, and suddenly, oh, I've got another sword now that's given to you for free, and it's like, it's kind of like, I don't quite understand. I don't, like I said, I don't want to criticize it, and to be fair, it might be that this is more about leaning into like damage stacking and DPS more than it is, you know, these unique abilities. And so the idea is that as you're playing and you're getting new accessories and gear, you're kind of trying to be like, oh, I really like this ability or this set of abilities, I want to enhance that. And so that then when you're in a boss fight or whatever, and you stagger an enemy, you lean into, you get that damage stacking kind of going the when the enemy's staggered, and then once it's at like the max damage, you then attack with like that strong ability, and then you dish out like even more damage than you would have done otherwise. And so if that's the case, then that's cool. And to be fair, on that note, I'm kind of trying to keep my expectations in check and kind of not try and be like, you know, like want the game to be something it's not, especially from someone like me who is kind of still pretty new to Final Fantasy, I would say. Like I platinumed 15, but I know 15 wasn't particularly complex as a game. Uh, and 7 Remake I've played a few hours of, but 7 Remake also does this as well with like the whole, changing your armor doesn't do anything. Um, and so I think to be fair, it's kind of the story that kind of keeps me interested right now, and it was the same with 7 Remake. So yeah, so I don't want to criticize those aspects too much because that might be unfair of me, and plus like if Final Fantasy is not that kind of game, then uh, that's not what it is, and so I shouldn't try and expect that from Final Fantasy. One thing that I do think is really cool about Final Fantasy, though, is how disparate each game is. Like, it's crazy to think that Final Fantasy VII Remake and 16 are in the same franchise, but yet there are very few elements that actually tie them together, and I think that's a really cool and unique aspect of Final Fantasy, and something that I actually didn't realize until not long ago. I just never heard anyone say this. I'd never heard it. At least I don't think I had. But I guess when you look at 7 Remake and you look at 16, they do look like quite different games, aesthetically. But you never know, right? You never know with like different games that you're not used to. You don't know uh, what kind of goes on in those universes. So yeah, and back to the RPG aspect just quickly. There's some resource that you can find, and that ties into crafting as well. But nothing seems particularly crazy there so far. You're just upgrading gear. But it's still cool. I'm still kind of I'm curious. I obviously don't know if things get deeper as I go along. I'm hoping anyway. The game's going to get more difficult. I imagine there's got to be some kind of side content that maybe is going to be more challenging. But it's kind of like I think I felt similar about Final Fantasy 15, to be fair. Like, thinking back, I almost want to say that I had a similar feeling there where it was like, things didn't quite feel like what I'd expected from an RPG, but maybe my expectations for RPGs were different based on other games. And again, maybe that's unfair of me to kind of bring that across to Final Fantasy because they do things differently. And so yeah, honestly though, I'm still really enjoying the game, and I think it's great, and it maybe will be my game of the year. I don't quite know yet. I'm honestly kind of hazy on what my game of the year is because first I said it was Dead Space, and then it was kind of Jedi Survivor, but I sort of still think Dead Space was just awesome, and I'm really happy with that remake. But uh, Final Fantasy 16 has also got so much about games that I like in it, and I'm just really wrapped up in this world and these characters and the story and just the way it's directed and the combat's awesome. And so yeah, it's honestly difficult to say right now in regards to that. But as a game though, really enjoying it, and I'm curious to know more about the RPG aspects. So trying to keep my expectations in check, and just kind of accept what it does and critique it for what it is rather than entirely on what I like in games or what I wanted from it or what I was hoping for. Um, so yeah, I'm looking forward to getting more. Hope you've enjoyed listening to my thoughts. Let me know in the comments if you've been playing it, what you think. This video is actually, all this video's podcast or whatever has been longer than I anticipated, which always seems to be the case. But once I get going, I'm just like I just talk honestly, and that's what it's all about. And so yeah, I'll leave it there. I don't know what I'll be talking about next week. If you're curious, I've done some recent stuff on. I spoke about Nintendo's Direct a couple of weeks ago, or last week, I think it was, like this time last week. And I also did a video on the State of Destiny right now, which is a same video again, but a long podcast discussion. So if you're curious about any of those, they're on my channel, and so check those out. But otherwise, thanks for listening. As I said, let me know what you think of Final Fantasy 16, if you're enjoying it, if you're planning to get it, what you're curious about. If you have any questions about it, be sure to fire away in the comments. No spoilers, please. Yeah, I'll leave it there. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Ciao, ciao, ciao.